I was very influenced by my father, who was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. He was very scientific. One of the most unusual features of my near-death experience was that I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander. I initially assumed had to be some vast hallucination, but that's before I realized just how damaged my neocortex and brainstem were. They should not have been able to conjure up any kind of dream or hallucination, much less the most profound experience of my entire existence. We have the traces that show us that our materialist understanding is false and incomplete, but we don't really know where to go beyond that. So there's plenty of evidence in the neuroscientific world that the brain is not the big hero in the story of conscious awareness and phenomenal experience. And I wish Rene Descartes had said, I am aware of thoughts and therefore I am. This is the dream.
Dr. Eben Alexander, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. I'm absolutely thrilled with this opportunity because you are a neurosurgeon, former neurosurgeon, and at the same time, a near-death experiencer. So somebody who has had a first-hand experience, and the experience, from what I heard, was absolutely unique. So you're completely qualified to talk about the relationship between the brain and consciousness, both as a doctor as an ND experiencer. The first question I have, I understand from earlier interviews that you gave that prior to ND experience, you were really a traditional materialist, right? You thought that brain generates consciousness, or you were in the camp which said consciousness doesn't exist at all, only brain exists. Which of the two camps were you in?
Excellent question. And it turns out that, I was very influenced by my father, my adoptive father, who was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. He was very scientific. It just so happens he was also had a strong belief in a loving personal God and the power of prayer. And that's because it had supported him through his life. He was a combat surgeon, Pacific Theater in the Second World War, and then chairman of a neurosurgical training program in the US. So I took my lead from him. And that meant that early on, with all those journeys to church when I was a child under his tutelage, I wanted to believe what I heard in that Methodist church. And yet in my more than 15 years of teaching at Harvard Medical School, teaching neurosurgery, getting deeply into the field, fascinated by brain-mind consciousness, I was mystified by how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And it really took me a kind of a dark night of the soul to go through all this. In fact, those kind of competing interests of understanding came to a head in February 2000 when my older son, Eben IV, was doing a school project in which he wanted me to dig deeper into my biological family heritage. And I'd been rejected before. Every time I contacted the children's home where I was adopted, they'd always say, your birth mother's not looking for you, so forget about it. But in February 2000, I got a different answer and said my birth parents were out there. They actually got married and had 3 children, but that the youngest daughter had died in 1998 and they were still grieving her loss. So I was told it was not a good time to come back in their lives. And that sent me into a dark night of the soul that lasted from 2000 until 2008 when I had my coma. And of course, those who read my book, Proof of Heaven, and the follow-up book, Living in a Mindful Universe, will realize that I met my birth family about a year before coma. And that was an absolutely essential ingredient for all this to unfold. But then in the story itself, the near-death experience itself, there's a dramatic kind of reunion with the spiritual guide. And I only find out 4 months after my coma who that spiritual guide was. But it's deeply tied in with that adoption story and with my coming to awaken to a much grander sense of myself, my relationship to the universe, and that binding force of love that is so obvious to a near-death experiencer, and that in fact, I bathed in that love of this universe in my near-death experience. And I would say that was a huge part of my healing, because what the world is gifted with my story is not just my account of it and my spiritual journey, but also the medical facts of the case, which are not only supported in my story in Proof of Heaven, but are elaborated upon and validated by a medical case report written by three doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my miraculous recovery from a Western medical viewpoint. And there's no explanation for this complete recovery given my weakened coma to a severe gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis. None of it should have happened, and yet it all did, including this inexplicable recovery. And in fact, when the peer reviewers of that medical journal, the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, in 2018 challenged the three doctors who wrote the case report, how do you explain this? This is unprecedented. Nobody this sick from bacterial meningoencephalitis ends up having a full recovery. They said, well, it's because he had a near-death experience. And all involved realized, yes, there are other cases of near-death experience with miraculous healing like this. And that's what I think the world needs to pay attention to, is this ability to come into wholeness and to heal beyond any kind of Western medical intervention. Is really kind of the power that comes into this deeper human understanding of the possibilities for our free will. So yes, I was a materialist neuroscientist. Before my coma, I had come to believe that the brain must be creating consciousness, although nobody had the remotest clue how the brain could do that. And since my coma, I've come to realize there are plenty of lines of evidence that show us very clearly that consciousness is not provided by the brain. In fact, it's a self-awareness of the universe to which we as sentient beings have access. And it's a much better way to look at this conscious awareness and to put things in proper perspective, to realize there is a top-down causality, that the world ultimately is idealistic in nature, and that mind over matter is something all of us can start to harvest and realize by practicing meditation, by going within, by testing kind of the boundaries of our sense of conscious awareness and the influence of our will. And certainly in power of prayer and distance healing and I would say spontaneous remissions and miraculous healing in NDEs, all of that is covering the topic of mind over matter, presented in a very powerful and useful fashion to human beings.
I know you probably told the story a million times, but how it happened and what have you seen, what have you experienced during the ND?
Important to point out, one of the most unusual features of my near-death experience was that I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander. I had no memories of being a human on this earth, this universe. You know, I really went in there with an empty slate. And in the months and years after my coma, it became clear to me why that was necessary, was to completely take me back to square one in terms of no presumptions or pre-existing prejudice about the nature of the universe, but really taking things at face value as they occurred. And that's one reason that amnesia was absolutely critical. But of course, when I first woke up from coma, all those memories were still gone, including all my neuroscientific knowledge. And I had no idea how sick I'd been. So the next few weeks and months were spent going to the hospital, reviewing medical records and scans, talking over with my doctors, trying to make sense of this experience, which I initially assumed had to be some vast hallucination. But that's before I realized just how damaged my neocortex and brainstem were. They should not have been able to conjure up any kind of dream or hallucination, much less the most profound experience of my entire existence. So given the background of that amnesia, it all started in what I call a primitive earthworm's eye view, very coarse kind of underground realm. I had no body awareness, but I had a sensation. I could feel roots, blood vessels around me. Visual kind of auditory memory is all there, this pounding, monotonous sound. And it seemed to go forever, but luckily it did not. I was rescued by this slowly spinning white light that came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And as that light approached me, it opened up like a rip in the fabric of this ugly earthworm's eye view realm and led up into a brilliant, ultra-real gateway valley. And that was a realm of intersection of earth and spirit. It's the place where we would reunite with higher souls, reunite with souls of departed loved ones, go through life reviews, make course corrections, and then plan our next incarnations. Because a gigantic part of my knowledge concerning this whole process is that our souls come back again and again, that we're sharing that dream of the one mind with this sense of compartmentalization of our individual mindset. And yet when we get to the edges, like in this experience in NDE, we realize that our mind can overlap minds of others, both those still incarnate in physical form and overlap the minds of those who've left the physical, because in that spiritual realm, we're outside of time and space. And so our existence doesn't come to an end as it does for the physical body in the material realm, but in fact, our awareness is expanded dramatically. And that's what I recognized and experienced fully in this Gateway Valley. It was way too real to be real, as I told my older son, Eben the Fourth, when he came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital, a day before Thanksgiving in 2008. To me, I was still going by what my doctors had told me, that the dying brain can play all kinds of tricks. And I remember he gave me a big hug. He told me later it was like there was a presence within me, a light shining within me. I was more present than I'd ever been before. And he was the one who encouraged me to write it all down before I read anyone else's near-death experience. That was the best advice ever. I wrote 20,000 words on my core experience, everything I could remember. And then I dove into reading the NDE literature. And that's where I was shocked to find tremendous similarities and overlap with my experience. But in that next realm up, what I call the Gateway Valley, lots of spiritual features. Well, the Earth-like features, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing, millions of other butterflies, looping and spiraling in vast formations below us in this verdant, fertile meadow, surrounded by a rich green forest, thousands of beings. I call them souls between lives, all this dancing joy and merriment, being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs, these pure spiritual beings leaving a golden dusty trail against a blue-black velvety sky. But they were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And I remember in this part of the journey witnessing what I call the divine breath of God, the divine wind. And it was a soft summer breeze that blew through. And in that setting of my amnesia, it was my first awareness of that infinitely loving God force that, many other NDEers, near-death experiencers, prophets, mystics, going back thousands of years have witnessed that same phenomenon. And I came back to realize that we try to define and limit it. We try to say, oh, that's God. Oh, that's Allah. Oh, that's Brahman. Oh, that's Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, all the different names we apply, instead of sitting back and realizing when you don't try and confine it and own it linguistically, we're all talking about the same thing. It's the common ground of our conscious awareness. It's available to us in meditation and centering prayer. So you don't have to have an NDE. Start exploring consciousness through meditation or prayer, and these same kind of profound truths can become evident to you, even though the NDE is a powerful catalyst that helps one jump to that whole next level of understanding. But all this is showing us is stuff that all of us can come to realize through our own explorations in consciousness. Now, in that beautiful Gateway Valley, there was a companion, a spiritual companion, a beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead, broad smile. She never said a word. She never had to, but her telepathic reality came into my awareness. And we became one in this beautiful emotional melding of oneness and knowledge. And that was her message to me in that setting that I converted to words weeks later when I was writing it all down. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are deeply cared for. And it was the most reaffirming and an extraordinary, reassuring message. I cannot tell you how confusing my journey had been to that point. But now all of a sudden, everything started to fall into place. I realized this was a spiritual home, felt very much at home there, like, oh, finally, at last, I have returned to what I know. And that was just the beginning of this expansion of visions in that Gateway Valley. And then the choirs, the angelic choirs, provided yet another musical portal to higher and higher levels. I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down. Then all of that spiritual realm with a completely different temporal ordering of causality, something I call deep time or meta time, that allows for people to have things like a life review, where your whole life is instantaneously visible to you, but in a setting where there's a higher temporal ordering to allow for growth, understanding, transformation, evolution of consciousness, all of that. But it shows us that the earth time that we're conscious of here in these material bodies is subservient to a much richer deep time or meta time that allows for the evolution of souls and soul groups and the evolution of all consciousness itself. And that portal led me up into what I call the core. an infinite inky blackness filled to overflowing with that divine love, that infinitely healing force of that unnameable God force at the core of the universe. And that's why it's, to me, it's kind of humorous how people back here try and cram a certain vision of that force into their ideology instead of just accepting this beautiful, universal, loving force of God that is a force of healing and wholeness and of knowledge and of coming into deeper understanding. Now, it turns out that I was taught many things in that core realm, and I'm still harvesting the lessons 14 years after the NDE by meditation. I use sacred acoustics, a very powerful form of differential frequency brainwave entrainment. And I meditate daily. And much of that meditative effort is to promote healing and wellness around this world. But a lot of it is also devoted to returning to my NDE, not just to recover memories, but to develop ongoing and evolving relationships with the various forces, powers, entities, and guides that I encountered in that realm. And one of those guides now includes the soul of my father. Interesting to me, as I read all that NDE literature after my coma, was to realize that my father should have been there front and center. He had passed over 4 years before my coma, and yet he was nowhere to be found. In our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, I tell the whole story of how through meditation, I encountered his soul in a deep meditation about 2.5 years after my coma experience that explains so much. And my ongoing relationship with him has helped me to come to a much deeper understanding of consciousness, of the role of things like sacred acoustics and differential frequency brainwave entrainment that affects the lower brainstem that allows us to have that connection. And that's what I've returned to. But back to my original experience, I would cycle through these realms multiple times. But I was always told on entering the core, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. And that was, again, with the promise of many things to be taught, which did occur through multiple transitions. But there came a point where I could no longer recall the musical notes of the melody to conjure up that portal that led from the gateway, from the Earthworm Eye View up into the Gateway Valley. And that was coming towards the end of my experience. And that's when I had this vision of thousands of beings around me going off in the distance with heads bowed, some holding candles, and this murmuring energy coming from them in many ways was bringing back the same sense of pure love and spiritual home and kind of comfort that I'd first experienced in the Gateway Valley and then in the core realm through bathing in this ocean of love. But now I was surprisingly feeling it down in this lowest, murkiest realm, surrounded by all these beings. When I wrote all that up weeks later, I said that was the power of prayer. And that's what I was witnessing on ushering me back to this world. I didn't even know where I was headed. So I was kind of trusting in all this. And that's when I also saw 6 faces that would bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words that I didn't understand, then disappear. And those faces were very important because, in fact, 5 of them were people physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours of coma. And none of the people who had been there the first 4 or 5 days of coma were present in those memories. So this truly showed me the vast majority of the coma experience happened between days 1 and 4 of the coma. And all of that is explained, the timing of that in the books Proof of Heaven, and especially the follow-up in Living in a Mindful Universe. We cover all of that. But then what I saw was finally the 6th phase, and that was a phase of a 10-year-old boy. And I didn't recognize him at the time, but it turns out that was Sunday morning, day 7 of coma back here on Earth. The doctors had just gone through a conference with the family saying I'd gone from 10% chance of survival down to 2% chance with no chance of recovery. And so they were, in fact, that was really the end of the experience from that perspective. And yet what I realized was this beautiful young voice pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. And I couldn't understand the words, but it got through to my soul on a deep level. And I thought the entire journey, this can continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. Now I realized it all mattered. And it was probably the only moment of true fear I felt in the entire journey, because now I had to come back to be there for this other soul. It turns out our son's name, that 10-year-old boy, was Bond. And of course, that's a perfect name for him. He was my bond to this earth. He was my ability to return back to this world. And even though when I first awoke in that ICU bed, I still didn't recognize loved ones at the bedside, those memories were to return over the next few hours and days. And my language wasn't even present when I first got back. I could muster the words "thank you" when they pulled out the breathing tube, but it took me hours and days to really get my language back, and a lot of those memories took 2 months for all memories to come back, including all that semantic knowledge. But the whole 14-year process since then has been working as a neuroscientist to come to a much deeper understanding of the reality of those realms and how to understand them in a modern scientific setting that obviously also implies the spirituality of the universe and our spiritual nature as beings.
The stories, I can't even qualify that, beautiful, just beautiful. And so optimistic, so positive, not something most of us live with, this fear of death, oh, it's coming, it's looming, and the closer you get, oh, it's worse. And on the sense of self, I was wondering, and you partially replied to that. So for you, when you were in coma, for you, the sense of self was completely gone. It was pure non-local experience, right?
Absolutely. And at times in that core realm, it was becoming the entire, multiverse throughout all of eternity. I mean, this was a gigantic case of dissociation, but then reassociation with the mind of the universe, essentially, which I would say is what all NDEers go through. And yet, the interesting thing when you study these cases, and especially you study, for example, the rich scientific literature on reincarnation out of the University of Virginia, where over the last 6 decades, they've studied more than 2,700 cases of past life memories in children. And in 1,700 of those cases, they've actually solved it. That is, they actually identified the previous person to have existed that the child is describing. But when you put all of this big kind of conceptual notion together about consciousness, brain, mind, the nature of reality, it just shows us we need a much bigger theater of operations, and that ultimately the answer will be one in which consciousness is unified and in many ways ties us into this loving and very homely presence that we have with the universe at large. And so we realize that when we die, it's not an extinction of our conscious awareness, which is what materialists would presume, but it's actually an expansion because we're liberated from the prison, the shackle of this physical brain and its illusion of self, illusion of a sense of here and now, and liberated into that far richer realm of the mental that is not bound by time and space and that allows us to glimpse a far grander reality for our soul's mission in this universe. And it turns out that in those stories, especially in those reincarnation memories, you realize even though we seem to dive back into this ocean of oneness and love, that is truly our spiritual home, and it's very comforting, as NDEers will assure you. But there's some kind of, as I call it, a viscosity to these soul lines, to where then when we're born again into a new body, we can still have memories of that past life. They can even influence our behavior. A lot of these children have phobias and behaviors that are dictated by some of the events of their past life. In fact, the whole world of transpersonal psychology takes advantage of this observation by people like Stan Grof, Carl Jung, Michael Newton, Brian Weiss, and others, that when we acknowledge our past lives and the events that occurred there and emotions that occurred there, we can better explain much of what goes on in this life. So it helps us to come to a much deeper and richer understanding of who we truly are when we get rid of the silly fiction of thinking that we're just born into this body and this is our entire existence. And in fact, it's important to point out that those memories in children, as Dr. Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, the main investigators at UVA, will tell you, must be harvested before age 5 or 6, because they're natural processes that cover over these memories of past life and between lives, so that most of us as young adults and adults don't have ready access to those memories. But they can come back through an NDE, through other spiritually transformative experiences, what have you. They're hypnotic regression, there meditation. There are many ways to recover those past life memories and glean a much deeper sense of who we are living this incarnation, but through the reflection of prior incarnation.
I've read that many people after NDE say that the reality, what they saw there, was more real than this one when they came back. How was it for you? Was it when you got back, was it like you wake up from a dream, or it was
Well, I'll
like,
tell you what, this is the dream. Because what you realize is the majority of near-death experiencers will tell you, and have been saying for over 2,000 years, is that world is much more sharp, crisp, alive, and real than this world. This world seems murky and dreamlike by comparison. Part of the reason for that, the reason these experiences are often described as ineffable or undescribable, is because they involve a different mode of knowing, what I call knowledge through identification, where you actually become huge swathes of the scene being presented to you. That's, for example, why a life review would work. And many people describe that life review as being remarkable, especially because you don't really experience things from your own perspective, but from the emotional perspective of those around you who were affected by your actions and even your thoughts. So it's a very powerful demonstration that the apparent boundaries of self that we are so sure of in these physical bodies are in many ways questionable and start to disappear when we explore consciousness, and especially have an event like a near-death experience, which shows us this universality of mind and how our mental contents can overlap that of others, both of people still incarnate in physical form, still, kind of conscious, using their brain as a filter, and those who've left the physical world and departed. Which are the most common ingredients of near-death experiences, are souls of departed loved ones. And that goes across cultures going back thousands of years. That is the common ingredient. But I think this is really important to show this kind of connection of soul groups and a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives when we realize that as these groups of souls working together, we're here to learn and teach important lessons about this deep nature of unity that we share through conscious awareness, the conscious mind. And then, in fact, we share an awareness with that mind of God, essentially. That's what near-death experiencers have been describing for thousands of years, is oneness. And to me, in the core realm, it was crystal clear that that God force of pure love and wholeness and oneness was the very origin of my conscious awareness. And I would say that is true for all of us, that our very conscious awareness is ultimately sourced for its very existence in that God awareness at the core of the universe. And it's only as we kind of get out far away from the sanctum sanctorum and the divine and that core realm that we're allowed to witness these kind of apparent impurities, traces of evil, things like that, that allow us to manifest free will. And that free will is best applied in our lives and soul journey when it reflects oneness, kindness, love, mercy, acceptance, forgiveness, and that this whole concept of life reviews showing us how if we hurt others and show a lot of greed and selfishness, that looks very bad in that light of love of that realm. And so that's why we're gently nudged through these life reviews towards more of a life of the higher soul, of altruism, philanthropy, of taking care of the least, the last, and the lost, helping others, being of service to humanity at large. This is where we really start to have soul growth. But it's by realizing that little ego mind and that little self can be a very toxic little thing. And in fact, in the world of addiction medicine, you'll find ego diseases all over the place. And in fact, many therapists will do a ritual sacrifice of the ego because the ego would much rather see the host dead than see itself dead. And that's why this ritual sacrifice of the ego, with its rebirth in a much healthier, more holistic form, is often the therapeutic move that helps people overcome things like addiction and a horrific fear of death, for example, in terminal cancer patients. And those things can be relieved by inviting higher soul in. And of course, Karen and I often in our work, she's the co-author and my life partner, co-author of Living in a Mindful Universe. But in our work, we often talk about this notion of the higher good and boundaries of self and dissolving those in this beautiful process of objective idealism and identifying with that one mind, traversing that veiling function of the brain to become one with that God force, and to do that through meditation in ways that can help us grow into this higher soul that we all truly are, and let that little ego mind spend a little time in time out. because that's not ultimately who we are. I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate. And you should give it no more credence than that, an annoying roommate. Because in fact, your conscious awareness is a much richer mystery than just being able to observe the ego mind of your linguistic brain. And this is where meditation can be a very powerful tool to help us rise above the simplistic falsehood of the ego and realize we're much greater than that. And then to glean those beautiful lessons of deep centering prayer and meditation to help bring healing and wholeness back to this world. But it all begins with the recognition that we're sharing the one mind. And this is something that many scientific investigators have come to realize. If you go to GalileoCommission.org, scienceandmedicalnetwork.net, other places like this, you'll find plenty of evidence that the scientific community is well on the pathway towards objective idealism, understanding the top-down nature of mental causation in the universe, and freeing sentient beings like Homo sapiens, human beings, to realize that their free will does have a tremendous impact on the emerging reality that we all witness.
You know, the other extreme, people who've had this strong spiritual experiences, that they start almost devaluing this life, you know, this embodied existence. There is even a tribe in Amazon where, you know, they don't live longer than 35 because they say, well, I'm missing my auntie, so they take poison and they just die, you know, very, very young. So for them, the value of this life, they prefer to be there than here. You know, they have their own set of beliefs and so forth. But you touched a little bit upon it. But so that realm, of course, is very real, what you say there. But what's the purpose of us being in these bodies? You know, it also must be real, and also it must have a purpose, right?
Well, certainly the way I saw it from my perspective in my NDE and in the 14 years of analyzing it since that time is that the real living and the learning and teaching of these life lessons occurs here in the physical realm, and that there's a purpose behind that programmed forgetting to where we come into these lives and we still can have memories as a young child of our past lives, but all of that is covered over so that we have buy-in, we have skin in the game to this incarnation. And I believe that's all for a purpose. I would actually look at incarnation and then the between lives period as like breathing, inhale and exhale. And this is like the big inhale when we're down here, where we're living these lessons temporarily dumbed down to the knowledge of our higher soul. But this is how we learn and teach these concepts of love and oneness and connection against the kind of challenges of like the materialist paradigm and those kind of predominant cultural modes of thinking that happen to be false from a scientific perspective. When you look at quantum physics, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, all the evidence for non-local consciousness is overwhelming. And yet our common kind of cultural sense is that the material world is all that exists, and that in fact, that materialist science would try and tell you that you have no free will, that it's all just chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain, giving an illusion of free will. But I would say, when viewed from the perspective of these powerful spiritual experiences, and there are hundreds of thousands reported out there on the internet and in books, and there are millions by extrapolation from polls of souls who have been through all this, experienced this, come to this deeper knowing. In fact, much of the interest in the book Proof of Heaven that I wrote in 2012, much of that initial kind of splash and interest around the world was from other experiencers who recognized something they had been through and found the commonality in my description of my experience. Now, the thing is, it goes far beyond just butterflies and jungles and forests and this kind of thing. It's more about the kind of ambience of the understanding and the transformation that comes from this kind of experience, that tells you much more about the true depth and power and meaning of the experience, and why it's not just some vast hallucination, but in fact is kind of the will of that higher mind kind of slowly manifesting in all these sentient beings going through this process of self-discovery.
Can I be just devil's advocate for a minute? I just want to explore a little bit possible explanations, what we hear from mainstream science. So using your knowledge and experience as a medical professional, as a neurosurgeon. So I would say that your experiences are hallucinations because your brain is starved of oxygen, so releasing maybe neurochemicals. That's the way brain dies.
It's important to, for one thing, go to the medical facts in that case report in Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, September 2018, by Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. That case report makes it very clear that my brain was far too damaged, and the objective evidence through neurologic exams, through CT and MRI scans, showing that my entire neocortex and brainstem were badly disabled by this gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis, to a point where I could not have had any kind of dream or hallucination. All those parts of my brain were inactivated. So how come I had the most robust, powerful, profound, memorable, life-changing experience of my entire existence, which I can prove by those veridical time anchors, happened at a time when my Glasgow coma scale, which in you or me would be 15, anything below 9 is deep coma, and my scale was 6 or 7, probably down as low as 5, much of that week. In fact, all of that week where I had this experience. So that's mystery number one, but it's supported by scientific evidence. Many papers since 2012 looking at the brain of people under the influence of psychedelic substances like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, active principle, and ayahuasca. And these papers out of Imperial College in London by Robin Carhart Harris, also out of a university in Brazil. They are looking at DMT, but all these papers concur. If you use functional MRI, magnetoencephalography to look at the brain while people are under the influence of these powerful psychedelic, I call them entheogens, do not call them hallucinogens, because that implies that these are just hallucinations. They are clearly not. They're much more important to that in terms of our association with reality. But what these papers all show is the brain goes dark. The brain is, there's no neuronal population anywhere in the brain leading to these extraordinary phenomenal experiences that people describe under the influence of those substances. The brain is going dark. It's getting out of the way. So as a scientist, materialist, if you're looking for the answer to explain these phenomenal experiences, you have to say, well, it's not in the brain. I have to go elsewhere. Well, you have to go elsewhere by expanding your knowledge and realizing objective idealism with this primordial mind as the ultimate reality, and then our brain serving as a reducing valve or filter that allows a limited form of that primordial consciousness to express in us as a self with a limited sense of here and now. All of that needs to be expanded to allow for the bigger vision, which is of top-down causality, of this mental layer of the universe, where the brain is not the producer of consciousness at all, but simply allows the states that are dictated from top down by this mental layer, by this one mind layer, to come into fruition. And that's what gives us free will as human beings, but also allows us to have free will above and beyond what we normally think of. I mean, the typical materialist would say, I have free will to think of raising my arm, and there it goes up, following my free will. But if I think I want to see, the mountain in the distance rise above the ground, I have trouble doing that. Well, the more we explore conscious awareness, we certainly find that this mind over matter has power in our healing. And the mechanisms of healing that come, for example, in my NDE or in Anita Morjani's near-death experience, where she cured a stage 4B lymphoma that had her within hours of death, or Dr. Mary C. Neal's near-death experience, where she had an over 30-minute warm water drowning while kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s, and she ended up having a full recovery. These are because of the spiritual nature of these adventures that lead to our spiritual awakening, which can bring us into wholeness. In other words, there's a tremendous power to this notion of mind over matter, especially when it comes to our health and healing.
What I found scary actually is that during my research, when I was looking into NDE cases, the mainstream science as doctors are so convinced that those are hallucinations that when people come after NDE, they are put on anti-hallucinogenic drugs, literally. So this is ridiculous, right? And if I told you, for example, there are little men jumping behind me on my desk, and you say, I don't see it, but if you stuck me into the brain scanner or EEG, you would see a brain activity. There is a brain activation. Even if there is a hallucination, we already know that, right? That's already a proven fact. So that's why I'm saying it's a little bit scary what's happening with people who went through this experience and how they are, let's say, received and treated by medical profession afterward. So
Well, that's one of the main reasons I wrote the book Proof of Heaven, was not only to help people who've had such experiences, but to help the medical profession and the scientific community to wake up to this much deeper reality. Um, and I'll point out in our book, there's a new 10th anniversary edition of Proof of Heaven, and it has a new foreword in it where I discuss what's happened over the last 10 years since that book came out and why it's important. It's all about this advance in scientific understanding of consciousness. And one of the things I discuss in that new foreword is the fact in 2018, we were at a neuroscientific meeting in Belgium about these kind of topics when one of the neuroscientists from Stephen Laurier's group in Liège got up and put up a slide where she pointed out that the book Proof of Heaven, published in 2012, was associated with a fourfold increase in the number of scientific papers published on near-death experiences that occurred in the years since publication of Proof of Heaven, compared to the frequency of such papers in the scientific literature for the 32 years that preceded the book Proof of Heaven. So when Proof of Heaven came out, this tremendous fourfold influx in scientific papers globally around the world. And what that shows you is that the scientific community is waking up to this. And I would say within the next decade, no self-respecting, well-read, scientifically educated person on earth will doubt the reality of primacy of consciousness, that we're sharing the one mind, that the afterlife visions that people have are very real. They show an ongoing connection with loved ones, and that reincarnation memories are likewise supported by this bigger model of mind, that God mind, basically, and the whole world emerging from that. And we as sentient beings have the power to influence that emerging reality. But this is where all the evidence leads, and the evidence is not going away. Now, the mainstream science has made a giant mistake for decades by ignoring the evidence, debunking the evidence, not paying attention to the evidence, but they're paying the price for that now because their materialist model goes nowhere in explaining the nature of reality. Whereas idealism and a lot of the very erudite discussion about objective idealism in the modern world and how we can look at the brain. And the brain is basically a quantum computer using Heisenberg's uncertainty principle at the level of synaptic vesicles and ion channels. I mean, this is something that was shown very nicely by Sir John C. Eccles, one of the Nobel Prize laureate, neurophysiologist, who did incredible work in showing how those quantum interactions at the neuronal level easily allow for fire or not fire based on energy thresholds where you don't have to violate any kind of conservation of energy because it's all within that Heisenberg uncertainty principle, whether or not that neuron even fires. So it's all under the control of that mind over matter realm of the universe. And it's all perceptions. Once we acknowledge that, we can start growing into this. So I sense your fear. I understand where it comes from, but I can tell you the scientific world is waking up rapidly to this far deeper and more profound truth about the nature of our existence as human beings. And it's very important that we dismiss once and for all that bleak and paltry fiction of materialism, because in fact, it's very dangerous. It is that kind of backdrop in our assumptions about self and others, combined with a misinterpretation of Darwinian evolution in the mid-20th century, that focus way too much on competition and not on what modern biologists would tell you is truly important in biological success. That's collaboration and cooperation between members of a species and across species. And that is a lesson not to be lost on our modern, very polarized and conflicted world with a lot of violence, a lot of, conflict between sentient beings. And it's time we awaken to the evidence and realize, no, we're all truly in this together. And when we pass from this world, we see the evidence for that in gigantic fashion. But why waste our lives pretending that we're separate beings and that it's this zero sum game and it's just all about greed and getting the most toys before you die, when those are not really the rules that this world goes by? And that as sentient beings with a deeper understanding of higher soul, of our connectedness through that primordial mind, we should come to realize we're all in this together. We should be helping each other and not competing in this wild, polarized, kind of autocratic, narcissistic sense of defeating each other. We're all in this together. And that is, I think, one of the most fundamental lessons. Religions have tried to teach that through the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is writ large in life reviews of NDEs going back thousands of years because we feel the impact of our actions and thoughts on others in that life review from their perspective. And to avoid, if for no other reason than to avoid having an abysmal life review, why not start treating others now with the love and respect they deserve as divine sacred beings that we all deserve, and start manifesting this respect, this kindness, this compassion for others, this mercy for all beings, and realizing that that oneness of that God force of pure love and compassion is the origin of our very conscious awareness. And we can all choose to bring that into this world and make the world a far better, more harmonious, prosperous, and peaceful place.
You mentioned Stephen Lorisse. I heard part of his interview. My feel is that what people say
Sorry,
on
that's
camera.
whose interview? I missed that. You heard?
He's a director of the Coma Lab in Liège. Stephen
Okay.
Lorisse.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Stephen Lurie, of course.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
I just missed the name.
so I'm listening to you and I remember what he said on camera, and I think these are smart people. but on camera somehow he said something like, during a cardiac arrest we cannot put equipment obviously and see what's happening in the brain because we're busy with other stuff, but we always interview afterwards when people come back and ask, do you remember anything? And those people who do remember something, what they do, we are looking for some visible effects in the brain, perhaps scars. So then I thought, my God, if mainstream science thinks that the root cause of NDE is neurological or psychiatric anomalies, and then afterwards they're looking for scars in the brain, then I think they must not have even a workable hypothesis because it just doesn't add up. So I'm listening to.
Well, you got to remember that materialist scientists have materialist techniques to study the material world. So it should really not surprise you that ultimately they keep getting yanked back, anchored down by that false assumption to thinking they're going to find the answer in the brain. That's why I think those scientific papers about LSD, DMT, and psilocybin showing the brain going dark, the default network just dissolving, those are very important. Pay attention, because what that is telling us ultimately is that to fully understand phenomenal experience, we should know to look beyond the brain. It's not going to be in the brain. The brain only gets out of the way. And so that's why this bigger vision. And, I think Stephen Lorisse is a very bright man. He's following the evidence. And sooner or later, everybody gets frustrated by pretending that we're going to find a materialist answer through causal chain of materialist events going on in the brain, for example. And we realize we just have to look much deeper, and there's much more. And part of the problem is we don't yet really have the techniques to study that in a quantitative fashion. And yet qualitative is very important. And for qualitative, for example, look at me. Here I am, 68 years old, in what I view as a kind of an amazing state of health for having been through what I went through 14 years ago with that severe gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis. How did all this happen? Well, it didn't just happen because I had that meningitis and my body kind of followed the pathway of that meningitis and its inflammation and the molecular effects of that and their interaction with my immune system. But there was something much bigger at play that allowed mind over matter to lead my physical self out of that quagmire and into this kind of wholeness and healing. through mind over matter. And this is where meditation and centering prayer can be so powerful. Like I said, it's something I use every day. Sacred acoustics is an extremely powerful way of getting beyond that veiling function of the brain. And it's mainly because those sounds have impact, whereas every sound you've ever heard, every chant, anthem, hymn that might have induced a transcendental state of conscious awareness, those are all processed up in the neocortex and circuits in the temporal lobes that have basically been derived in the last 1 or 2, 3 million years in primates and Homo sapiens. Very different from the processing of sounds of, say, sacred acoustics or other binaural beat brainwave entrainment. Those sounds are processed way down in the lower brainstem in circuits that arose more than 300 million years ago. And that's one of the reasons why I think in our workshops we see such power of liberating conscious awareness, to where people can have a very real experience of uniting with a departed loved one. And I have ready access to connecting with my father's departed soul. And it's more up to him than to me. But when I put in the effort over time, I start to get benefits from that. And it's just realizing that that realm is real, that our connection through that mental realm goes beyond death of the physical body. And this is where I think it's so important for humanity to wake up to this, because we really have a much bigger understanding of our potential, of the nature of our reality, and especially the potential for our free will to influence our emerging reality. And the more we learn about our connection with this mental realm of the universe, the more I think we can truly discover about our ability to will the world of our highest ideals into existence.
So basically, what I'm hearing from you, and please tell me if I'm wrong, is that under the prevailing physicalist, materialist paradigm, there is no way on earth they're gonna explain this phenomena, or find a way to deal with people who have gone through this experience properly. Instead of putting them on drugs, maybe
Right.
they need a meditation and somebody to
Well, I
talk
think
to, right?
meditation is the cleaner way to get there than the drugs. But yeah, I think you're making a very good point about all this, and it's I think important to understand how much power our will has in our healing and wholeness and coming into deeper understanding. But ultimately, we can only do that by realizing we're all truly in this together in a very deep fashion. Our very consciousness is rooted in the same source. Um, and that's why I think Proof of Heaven, Living in a Mindful Universe, and now the 10th anniversary edition of Proof of Heaven can help tremendously. Also, note that I do work again with the Galileo Commission.org, scientificandmedical.net, with these scientific groups that have been studying this for decades. In fact, there was a contest held last year by the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies, and people can read the 29 winning essays on their website, bigelowinstitute.org. But very important to point out, those 29 essays were written by experts in the field, selected from 204 essays provided from more than 1,000 applicants. And these essays do a yeoman's work in proving the reality of this larger consciousness of which I'm talking now, this primordial mind. And of course, in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we use a consilience of information from the hard problem of consciousness and neuroscience, binding problem and philosophy of mind, all the evidence for non-local consciousness, telepathy, precognition, presentiment, distance healing, psychokinesis, near-death experiences, shared death experiences, which are just like near-death but happen in perfectly healthy people, usually a relative of someone who's leaving the physical plane, and all those past life memories in children showing non-local consciousness. Every bit of that scientific evidence contributes to this modern understanding of objective idealism, and we lay out that entire argument in the book Living in a Mindful Universe. And I would say since that book came out in 2017, I've come to even richer realizations of kind of the exact role of quantum physics and how best to understand that. And a lot of that I would attribute my understanding to Bernardo Kastrup. He's been very helpful in my own personal understanding of my experience and helping me come to a much more rational, scientific way to accept it all. So I'm grateful to him and to other idealists around the world who have been promoting this. This is really an essential step forward for all of humanity if we are to survive it all. I would say that those terrible aspects of materialism, false sense of separation are leading us to a planetary death. Our addiction to fossil fuels, plastic pollution, et cetera. All of this is from that false sense of separation, not realizing that we're all together as one, as stewards of this planet, and we need to take responsibility for it.
I came across another researcher from France, Francois Lallier, and he's a doctor, he's a medical professional, and he's an NDE researcher. So what he's saying is that about 60% of children who have had NDE remember, and only 15% adults remember NDE. So his hypothesis is that everybody has this experience. It's just a question of remembering, and that he links to an optimally functioning brain. So the better is the functioning in the brain at the time of the occurrence, the more chances that you will remember. It's not a paranormal phenomena. It's a normal normal phenomena, if I can put it that way.
Well, I would say yes. Using the word paranormal or parapsychology is very improper. I mean, this is just these are all natural forms of consciousness. To say they're supernatural is very, very misleading because they have to do with nature. They have to do with the workings of the natural world. Conscious awareness is part of that natural world. But the interesting thing is it's the most amazing and profound aspect of the real world to understand. And that's where I think modern idealism really helps us to move to the next level. And part of it is realizing that we share, our sentient awareness can be in this material realm, but it can also exist in these higher realms that have more overlap with kind of other mental spaces. And so we need to acknowledge every bit of that. But I would say the part of his theory that says you need to have this intact brain in there, forget about it. I mean, there's plenty of evidence in the neuroscientific world that the brain is not the big hero in the story of conscious awareness and phenomenal experience. The psychedelic studies that I mentioned earlier are a perfect example of that. But there also are, say, examples of terminal lucidity that we often see in clinical medicine. Somebody who's demented, they might have been psychotic, demented for years, never a meaningful phrase or interaction with anybody over years and even a decade or more. And yet, as they come close to death within hours or a day or maybe a week, they wake up, their soul comes back in, communicates with loved ones at the bedside. Often they also witness loved ones who have left the physical world, and then they depart this world. Terminal lucidity has no explanation within, healthy brain needed for consciousness kind of expression. Terminal lucidity is a perfect example that the brain is not doing the work of producing consciousness anyway. There are also acquired savant syndromes where brain injury, stroke, autism, all of these forms of brain damage can actually unmask a superhuman mental capacity. That's a very important concept of the ability to calculate pi in one's head to thousands of digits. That can happen after a head injury or stroke. The ability to have photographic or eidetic memory can occur after some kind of brain injury. Autistic children can be very much in tune with this kind of higher soul nature of self that goes beyond the little petty, me and body self kind of images independent from the rest of the universe. So acquired savant syndromes are another beautiful example. And in clinical neuroscience, we have examples of people with hydranencephaly, things like that, where if you do a CT scan, you can find almost no brain. And yet there are cases where that kind of a patient also has an IQ of 126 and is working as a mathematician. So this kind of romantic fantasy that the brain ultimately is the producer of consciousness, we just got to let go of because it's just not so. It's false. And we need a bigger model. And that's where I think people exploring their own mental space through meditation, centering prayer, can become a very fruitful exercise for showing you the potential you have to influence your own life and that of others through going into your mental space.
I came across a quote, an archbishop who was also a brain surgeon was asked, and it was a while back, he was asked, so you are doing lots of surgeries, where in the brain have you seen God? And he said, well, I couldn't find mind there either.
That's right. Well, that's the important thing. Mind is not in the brain. Now, the
Exactly.
brain, I see it as a filter that, through all those quantum states of those ion channels and synaptic vesicles, it then allows that projection of the one mind down into our perceptual awareness. But the only thing that's ever existed is our perceptual awareness. We don't have to have that physical world existing out there. It can exist as an information field to which our awareness has access. And that's exactly what this notion of top down causality, the mental layer of the universe, is really all about.
You've experienced the states of consciousness in your lifetime, which are unattainable for most of us. And people say consciousness is like the wind. You can't see it, but only its effects. Um, what is consciousness for you?
Consciousness is simply self awareness, the awareness of existence. And it turns out, I think the best answer is to realize that the universe is self aware. That is a property of this universe that allows for that mental layer, which is a layer of information assimilation and integration, to serve as a touch point for sentient beings to influence the emerging world. So consciousness is very simply that awareness of existence. But the interesting thing is it's a profound mystery. And I wish Rene Descartes had said, he said, I think, therefore I am. But all he had to do was say, I am aware of thoughts and therefore I am. And it's that awareness that's the magic, not the thoughts themselves. But that awareness is the extreme power of this existence of the universe that we can all participate in. So I think that that's a worthy lesson for all of us to assimilate.
You spoke about a lot of interesting lessons and insights that came from your experience and your exploration of that experience afterwards. But what is the most important, the single most important lesson, the single most important insight?
I think the most important lesson is the binding force of love is absolutely real at the very core of this whole universe. That feeling that near-death experiencers going back thousands of years all describe, of that loving God force at the very core of this universe, of their experience of this universe. That's the most important lesson, because it is truly love that is the answer here. And that's why that false sense of separation inherent in materialist thought is so damaging. Because when we think we're separate, we can tend to get kind of self-centered. And that is a giant mistake. So more than 90% of near-death experiencers on recent polls basically say that God is real in some form. It doesn't have to depend on a religious depiction, but that a being of love and comfort, compassion, kindness, acceptance, and mercy is at the very core of our conscious awareness, especially when it's liberated from the shackles of the brain and body. That is important, because that God of love is absolutely real. And even though, people always get very up in arms when you say you're going to scientifically prove the reality of God, I would say that the modern scientific study of near-death experiences and other types of extraordinary human experiences all point towards one profound conclusion. And that is that loving force of connection, and kindness and mercy at the core of the universe that so many NDEers have experienced and gained tremendous benefit from, so that they no longer have any fear of dying. I think that lesson is the one that most needs to come out and permeate this world. Now, the objective idealism, the notion of the shared mind, is an important kind of concept to get to that. But the reality of that loving God force is what we really need to all admit, accept, and come to understand, and especially bring to force in our own lives. That's the importance of not only doing the meditation and centering prayer, but then living every action and thought of my life in this world, moment to moment, day to day, breath to breath, is lived from that perspective of that higher sense of togetherness, of love and compassion and kindness for my fellow beings.
What advice would you give to scientists, to young scientists, neuroscientists, people who just start in their career? Um, can science study consciousness? Can we bring consciousness into the way we do science, or it's an impossible proposition altogether?
I think remember to keep your eye on the ball, keep your eye on the question. The problem with modern scientists in many ways is that they tend to focus on the methodologies and the techniques that they have. And that tends to then guide them in a certain direction and limit their understanding of the deepest objective truth about the nature of reality. So, really kind of keep your eye on the process, on what's going on with human beings and how they're transforming, learning, how they're growing through this whole process and contributing to the evolution of all consciousness. And don't be kind of sucker punched by saying, but wait a minute, the only thing we can measure is, the functional MRI looking at the brain activity. Instead of that, let's focus more on the overall process, what people are going through, the kind of goals they're achieving, and over time, we'll be able to come up with the quantitative measures to help refine all that understanding. But at this stage in the game, our understanding is just far too immature to even design the proper experiments to really kind of nail this emergent reality. We have the traces that show us that our materialist understanding is false and incomplete, like all those psychedelic studies showing the brain going dark, but we don't really know where to go beyond that. So, but always staying focused on the bigger questions, even though they may seem most challenging and difficult to answer, but not succumbing to the silly game of saying, well, I only have access to these tools of measurement, so that's going to severely confine the kind of work I do and the kind of understanding I can come to. Be more open-minded about how to look at these big questions and how best to answer them.
Eben, thank you very much for your answers. A real wonderful story, and for the time you took to tell all that.
Natalia, it's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on, and I look forward to talking with you again sometime.